I picked up 6 different Bibles: King James, New International Version, New Revised Standard Edition, English Standard Version, New Jerusalem Bible, and my grandmother's old Catholic Bible, the one with the red ribbon marker permanently stuck somewhere in Psalms. I opened each one to the Gospel of Matthew. Page 1. I was preparing a Sunday school lesson, a simple one, about Matthew the Apostle, tax collector, one of the 12, the man who sat down and wrote the first Gospel. I wanted to read the opening, his opening. The way a document starts when a man identifies himself as its author. I read the first sentence, then the first paragraph, then the first page, then I went back to the beginning. Not one of them, not a single one of the 6 Bibles open on my desk, says, written by Matthew, anywhere in the text. I held that for a minute. I checked the front matter, the introductions, the table of contents. The title reads, The Gospel According to Matthew. Not the Gospel written by Matthew. Not I, Matthew, set down these things according to Matthew, that small word. According. The Greek word is kata. I had never stopped to ask what it meant. For 30 years. My name is Nathan. I taught history at a Catholic high school in Evansville, Indiana for 12 years. Before that, I was a Sunday school teacher. Before that, I was a Sunday school student. I want to tell you about a book my father gave me when I was 12 years old. It was a history of the Civil War, nothing fancy. A second-hand paperback. But on the flyleaf, in his handwriting, he had written his name, John K. Whitfield, and the year 1971. He told me, that is how you know who read it first, not the cover. The cover just tells you the title. The inside tells you who was there. That is how authorship worked in antiquity too, not printed on a cover, written inside, in the first person, by the author. I, Josephus, son of Matthias, set down this account of the Jewish war. That is how ancient authors identified themselves. They wrote themselves into the text, and the 4 Gospels contain no such line, not one, not anywhere. Here is the thing that I keep coming back to. Because this is not a fringe claim. This is not something you have to dig for in hidden archives. Bart Ehrman is a professor of New Testament studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has spent his career reading these texts in the original languages. His books are published by major academic presses and assigned in mainstream university courses. In Jesus Interrupted, published by Harper One in 2009, Ehrman states it plainly. The Gospels are all anonymous, not one of them names its author. He is not being provocative. He is describing what is actually in the manuscripts. All 4 Gospels are written in the third person. The narrative voice is external. It is the voice of someone reporting, not of someone who writes, I was there. I saw this. I am the one telling you. The earliest Christian writers who quote from the Gospels do not name their authors either. Justin Martyr, writing around the year 150 CE, refers to what he calls memoirs of the apostles. He quotes from texts we recognize as the Gospels. He does not say, Matthew wrote this, Mark recorded this. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around the year 110 CE. Same situation. He alludes to gospel material. He does not name who wrote it. The names first appear together, all 4, assigned to all 4 Gospels simultaneously, in a single source around the year 180 CE, 150 years after the events they describe. I will come back to that source. But first, let me walk through what the manuscripts themselves reveal about each of the 4, because the problem is not the same for each Gospel. Each one has its own specific problems, and understanding those problems is the only way to understand what happened in 180 CE. You learned Matthew's name before you could read. There was a picture of him in the illustrated children's Bible, the tax collector at his table, coins and ledgers, and then light, or a hand, and Matthew looking up from his accounts with the expression of a man who had just heard something that would change everything. You colored that picture. You were told he put down his ledgers and followed Jesus. You were told he sat down years later and wrote the first Gospel. You were told his name is on the book because he wrote the book. No one mentioned that image was created roughly 800 years after Matthew died. No one mentioned that the title page attribution was a tradition, not a documented fact. No one mentioned the word according to. You were not lied to. But you were given a conclusion without the evidence, and the evidence, when you look at it, is more complicated than the picture in the children's Bible. There are three specific problems with the attribution of the first gospel to Matthew the Apostle. The first is the language. The gospel we call Matthew is written in sophisticated literary Koine Greek, not street Greek, literary Greek, the kind of Greek that requires formal education and practice. Matthew was a tax collector in Capernaum. In first-century Galilee, tax collectors worked in Aramaic. The surrounding culture was Aramaic-speaking. The commercial records, the daily transactions, the spoken language of that community, Aramaic. There is a clue in the ancient sources. Papias of Hierapolis, writing around the year 130 CE, roughly a century after the events, mentions Matthew in connection with a written work. He says, Matthew compiled the oracles in the Hebrew language, and each person interpreted them as best he could. The Hebrew language, or Aramaic. Scholars debate the exact meaning of what Papias wrote. But here is the problem. The Gospel of Matthew that we have shows no signs of being translated from Aramaic or Hebrew. Textual scholars who have studied translation patterns across ancient languages are consistent on this point. The Greek of Matthew reads as original Greek composition, not as a text that was first written in another language and then rendered into Greek. If Papias's Matthew was written in Aramaic, it was not the same document we call the Gospel of Matthew. The second problem is more striking. The Gospel of Matthew borrows approximately 90% of the Gospel of Mark, word for word, in Greek. If you lay the texts side by side, the material is unmistakable. Not paraphrased, not drawn from a shared oral tradition, copied in the original language, verbatim passages running for multiple sentences at a time. Now think about what that means. An eyewitness apostle who walked with Jesus for 3 years, who was present at the Sermon on the Mount, who sat across the fire from the man he is supposed to have written about. Why would he copy from Mark? Mark was not one of the 12. By the church's own tradition, Mark was a later figure, a companion, possibly an interpreter, not an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus. If Matthew was there, why does he need to reproduce someone else's second-hand account? That is the logic the attribution requires. An eyewitness copies from a non-eyewitness. The third problem is the date. The Gospel of Matthew is dated by mainstream scholarship to approximately 80 to 90 CE, 50 to 60 years after the events it describes. Matthew the Apostle, if he was a young man when he left his tax table around the year 28 or 30 CE, would have been very old by 80 CE, almost certainly dead. 3 problems. Language that does not match the man, a dependence on a non-eyewitness source, a date that places the writing half a century after the events. None of these problems prove that Matthew was not the author, but each of them requires an explanation that the traditional attribution does not provide. The second gospel presents a different problem. Mark is the oldest gospel. Most scholars now place it first, written before Matthew and Luke, both of which borrowed from it extensively. The tradition attaching Mark's name to this gospel comes entirely from Papias of Hierapolis, that same source I just mentioned, writing around the year 130 CE, roughly a century after the events. Papias writes that Mark was Peter's interpreter or secretary, that Mark carefully wrote down what Peter told him, though not in order. This is the basis of the entire attribution. One source, writing 100 years later, with no documentation of how he obtained this information, and the internal evidence of the gospel itself raises questions. The author of Mark makes geographical errors about the region he is describing. Mark chapter 7, verse 31. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. The scholar Sean Frayne at Trinity College Dublin dedicated years to the geography and sociology of first-century Galilee. His book Galilee from Alexander the Great to Hadrian, published by the University of Notre Dame Press in 1980, remains a standard reference for scholars of the period. Frayne and others who have studied the regional geography identify this route, from Tyre through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, as geographically impossible given the actual landscape. It would be like giving directions across Indiana by saying, go from Indianapolis north to Chicago, then head south through Louisville to reach Fort Wayne. The direction is wrong. An eyewitness to the ministry, traveling through Galilee and the surrounding regions for 3 years, would not describe a route that contradicts the basic layout of the land. A writer working from second-hand oral reports, decades later, piecing together geography without direct knowledge of the terrain, might. The third gospel is the most interesting case, because it is the only one that tells you, in the author's own words, exactly how it was written. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you. Most excellent Theophilus, read that carefully. Those who from the first were eyewitnesses, the author is not one of them. He is describing them as his sources. They handed these things down to us. He received the tradition, he compiled it. He was not present himself, and he tells you what he did with what he received, carefully investigated everything. He is describing himself as a researcher, a compiler, someone who gathered and organized what the eyewitnesses had passed down. The Gospel of Luke opens with its author explicitly, clearly, stating that he is a secondary source. That is not interpretation. That is what the text says. In the first 4 verses, the same author wrote Acts. Luke Acts together is the work of a single writer, and in certain passages of Acts, chapters 16, 20, 21, 27, 28, the narrative shifts unexpectedly to first-person plural. We sailed, we arrived, we stayed. Those are the passages where the author apparently traveled with Paul. Only those passages. The rest of Luke Acts is third person throughout. He was present for some of Paul's journeys. He was not present for the ministry of Jesus. He wrote down what other people told him they had seen, and in the opening paragraph of his gospel, he said so. Luke literally told you. In the opening sentence of his own book, he said, I was not there. I investigated. I am writing from what others gave me. It is the first thing in the gospel. 4 verses in, you have read that opening, or heard it read, or sat through its recitation in a liturgy. He said it clearly. In the text that has been available to any reader for almost 2,000 years, the admission was never hidden. It was in the first paragraph, on the first page. The fourth gospel is in a category of its own. John's gospel never names its author, not once. The narrative refers repeatedly to a figure called the beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. This person appears at the Last Supper, at the crucifixion, at the empty tomb. But the beloved disciple is always referred to in the third person. John 13:23. One of his disciples, the one Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. John 19:26. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. John 22. She came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. Third person, always third person, a man describing someone else. Then comes the closing of the gospel. John 21:24. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. We, a community speaking about the beloved disciple. Not, I wrote these things. Not, I am the one whose testimony you are reading. We know that his testimony is true. The plural we indicates a community attesting to someone they are writing about, not someone writing about himself. Raymond E. Brown was a professor at Fordham University and Union Theological Seminary. His 2-volume commentary on the Gospel of John, published in the Doubleday Anchor Bible series in 1966, is one of the most detailed analyses of this text produced in the 20th century. Brown's conclusion on authorship was measured but specific. The Gospel of John, as we have it, was almost certainly produced by what he calls the Johannine community, a group of believers working within the tradition of an early witness, possibly associated with a historical figure connected to John, son of Zebedee, but not that figure writing in the first person. The beloved disciple is not the author identifying himself. He is someone the author is writing about. The closing verses of John are the voice of a community testifying to a person they loved, not a man setting down his own memoirs. Now let me read you something. Irenaeus of Lyon was a bishop in the late 2nd century. He died around the year 202 CE. Around the year 180 CE, he wrote a systematic work called Against Heresies, a refutation of Gnostic Christianity and the various alternative texts and interpretations Irenaeus considered outside the bounds of legitimate faith. In Book 3, Irenaeus addresses the Gospels. He assigns them 4 authors: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And then he explains why there must be exactly 4. Here is what he writes. It is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. For since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, and the church is scattered throughout all the world, and the pillar and ground of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars. He continues. He connects the 4 Gospels to the 4 living creatures in Ezekiel's vision: the eagle, the calf, the man, the lion. He assigns 1 creature to each Gospel: 4 corners of the earth, 4 winds, 4 living creatures, 4 Gospels. That is the argument. Not historical investigation, not surviving 1st century documentation, not testimony from people who had known the disciples or the disciples' companions. A theological argument about the number 4. There are 4 zones of the world. Therefore there must be 4 Gospels. The names were assigned to fit the number, not the number established to honor the names. I want to be precise about what this means and what it does not mean. Irenaeus did not invent these 4 Gospels. They existed. Communities were already using them. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were already circulating in association with these texts in various parts of the early church. What Irenaeus did was something different. He was the first person to assign all 4 names to all 4 Gospels simultaneously, to declare that the canon was exactly this set and no other, to give the institutional weight of his position as bishop to a specific list. And his stated reason for choosing exactly 4 was the number 4, not the evidence, the number. This is the theological genesis of the canonical authorship claim, not historical investigation, not a room full of people reviewing 1st century manuscripts. A bishop in 180 CE, who needed a framework, found one in the cosmological significance of the number 4, and attached the names accordingly. Before Irenaeus, Justin Martyr quotes from these texts without naming their authors. Papias mentions Matthew and Mark, but his descriptions do not match the texts we have. The Muratorian fragment, roughly contemporary with Irenaeus, lists Luke and John, but its beginning is missing, the section where Matthew and Mark would have appeared. It was Irenaeus who gave all 4 Gospels all 4 names at once, in 180 CE, based on the number 4. Someone chose these 4 names, not because they had a room full of 1st century evidence, not because they had located the original manuscripts and confirmed the handwriting, because the number required it. 4 corners, 4 winds. The books already existed. The communities that used them already existed. What was needed was a framework that could say these 4 and not the others, these authors and not some unknown. These texts carry the weight of eyewitness authority, even if the arguments for that authority were cosmological. And once the framework was in place, it held. Because the institution that chose it became the largest religious organization in human history, the names became permanent, not because anyone proved them to a standard that the evidence could support, because the decision was made, and the institution that made the decision survived. I spent a significant part of one winter with J.J. Benítez's Caballo de Troya series, specifically the sections where Benítez addresses the contradictions between the Gospels. Not vague inconsistencies, specific documentable contradictions. Benítez spent 40 years tracking the words attributed to Jesus across all 4 Gospel accounts, mapping what each author says happened at the same events. He documented more than 400 instances where the 4 Gospels contradict each other on specific details. Not differences in emphasis, not variations in tone, contradictions. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Jesus cleanses the temple at the end of his ministry. In John, he does it at the beginning. Both accounts are detailed. Both are presented as historical. One of them cannot be right about the timing. In Matthew and Luke, the genealogy of Jesus runs through different lines, different names, different ancestral chains connecting Jesus to Abraham and to David. If both Gospels were written by men who either knew the family or had reliable access to the records, the genealogies would not produce incompatible results. In the Passion narrative, the relationship between the Last Supper and the Passover calendar is explicitly different in John and in the Synoptics. John places the supper before Passover. The Synoptics place it during Passover. This is not ambiguous. The two chronologies cannot both be correct. Benítez's argument is not that the Gospels are lying. His argument is that this level of contradiction, across this many specific details, is not consistent with the work of four men who either witnessed the events directly or had reliable access to witnesses. Four men with direct knowledge of what happened, even working from imperfect memory, even writing decades later, would not produce this many contradictions in this many specific places. What four communities producing their own theological accounts of a received tradition, each shaped by their own history, their own conflicts, their own understanding of who Jesus was, would produce is exactly what we have. A man who spent 40 years comparing every line noticed what most readers who move through these texts devotionally are never asked to notice. The sources don't agree, not at the edges. In the center, somewhere near you right now, there is probably a Bible. The cover says the Holy Bible. Inside, the Gospels are titled the Gospel according to Matthew. You have read those words or heard them read hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times. You assumed the word according to was a formality, a modest way for an author to acknowledge that he was writing about something larger than himself, like a biographer who titles a book, A Life According to the Evidence. Now you know it was something else. It was the word that was there because no stronger word could be justified. Not by Matthew, not written by Matthew, not I, Matthew, tell you these things. According to, a word added by scribes and community leaders working roughly 80 to 100 years after the texts were first written. A word that was, in its way, honest. This account represents what was handed down in the tradition associated with Matthew. Not, this is Matthew speaking. According to, Irenaeus read 4 texts and needed 4 names. He found 4 names already circulating in various communities, attached loosely to these 4 texts. He chose them. He solidified them. He wrote down his reasoning, and his reasoning was about the number 4. The corners of the earth, the winds. The number came first. The names followed. You have been reading the result of that decision your whole life. Every time you opened a Bible to Matthew chapter 1, every time you heard the phrase in the Gospel of Mark, every time a priest or a pastor stood at the front of a room and said, a reading from the Gospel of John, you thought you were in contact with eyewitnesses. You were in contact with a decision, made in Lyon, France, around the year 180 CE, by a bishop who needed 4 pillars. The question is not whether the Gospels contain truths about the man they describe. That is a different question, and it belongs to you. The question is what you thought you were reading when you read them. You thought you were reading the testimony of men who were there. Bart Ehrman, Raymond Brown, Sean Frein. Years of scholarship, published, documented, available. They all converge on the same conclusion. The Gospels are anonymous. The names were added later. The 4-name attribution was formalized by a bishop who chose the number before he chose the names. The word according to was always in your Bible. It was trying to tell you something. Now you know what. You decide what to do with this.